All right, everybody, we are getting ready to get started. How are we feeling tonight? There we go, there we go. Let's do it one more time. How are we feeling tonight? We need to have some energy. Let's go. Awesome, awesome. Well, it is great to be here alongside each and every single one of you. My name is Miles Pendleton, and I'll be serving as our Master of Ceremonies for tonight's event. As we begin, we just want to take a moment and offer a land acknowledgement, acknowledging where we stand, the history of it, as well as the current and contemporary importance of this work that we do through acknowledging it. It is important to ground ourselves and acknowledge the people whose land we are utilizing, the Clackamas Chinook, the Wasco Wishram, the Willamette Tumwater, the Multnomah, and other Chinookan peoples, as well as the Tualatin Kalapuya, the Cayuse, the Malala, and other tribes and bands of the Columbia and Willamette Rivers. It is important to acknowledge the original inhabitants of the land now known as Tyrone Creek State Natural Area, and to recognize that we are here because of the sacrifices that were forced upon them. We also remember that we are guests of this land and must do our best to honor the original peoples through authentic cultural narratives and continued stewardship of the water, the land, and plants that make up this forest community. To follow our acknowledgement with action, we will continue to use our resources to prioritize partnerships with Indigenous tribes, tribal governments, and intertribal organizations alongside additional learning on land-backed policies. So it's no surprise to everybody here today why we gather to conduct this forum on Congressional District 5. The facts are clear. The current holder of the seat, Lori Chavez DeRemer, is not our first choice to represent us in Washington, D.C. She barely won 2 years ago, and as a Trump supporter, she doesn't represent the citizens of Oregon. C5 is a mixed district with Democrats, Republicans, and non-affiliated voters all maintaining a strong electoral presence. Alongside us here today to speak and to share their visions and share their responses with us are two wonderful public servants who I will introduce right now. We have Janelle Bynum, and Janelle Bynum is a state representative who is a four-time state legislator, a small business owner, an electrical engineer. She is the daughter of teachers and a mother of four. And additionally, we have Jamie McLeod-Skinner. Jamie McLeod-Skinner is a natural resources attorney, certified city planner and engineer, and small business owner. Additionally, talking a little bit more about CD5 and the districts that we are in, it consists of approximately 5,000 square miles, including most of Clackamas, Deschutes, Lynn, and some Multnomah and Marion counties. And furthermore, whoever wins the May primary will face a tight race in November. This is certainly a swing district. It's a district that has garnered and captured the attentions of folks all throughout the nation, and certainly our local and fellow Oregonians as well. And so this is an incredibly important race, and we're so glad that you all have joined us to listen to these responses and to really just hear about what options are out there so that we can move forward and do our very best to bring a Democratic candidate forward at this upcoming November election. Accordingly, it is now my pleasure to introduce our moderator for the evening, Dr. David Sarasohn, and I will offer a quick introduction for him as well. Dr. David Sarasohn is the former associate editor of the Oregonian Portland and a former nationally syndicated columnist for the Newhouse News Service. His columns have twice won Best and West honors. He has a PhD in American history from UCLA, and in 2002 was awarded the Eugene C. Pulliam Editorial Fellowship to study the Lewis and Clark Bicentennial. It's my distinct honor to pass the microphone off to David Sarasohn, Dr. David Sarasohn.
We think this is an important occasion in a very important race. As of Friday, when there's one more resignation, the Republican majority in the House of Representatives will be one. They may add a couple more from special elections, but you can see that every race is extremely important, and this is one of the key races in the country. So, to hear our candidates today, we're going to ask you not to applaud and not to yell and not to scream so that we can hear them for the longest time and we can ask the most questions. The format we've got is each candidate will have an opening statement of 3 minutes, and then questions and answers will be 90 seconds. Now, when a candidate is 30 seconds from her time running out, Mike will hold up a yellow card. When her time runs out, he will hold up a red card. She can finish her sentence, but if she continues to speak, he may get violent. I'll also say that the candidates have both said they are happy to be addressed by their first name. I am not being pushy. And to start, we have the opening statement from Janelle. I'm sorry, Jane.
Yeah.
Got it.
So first of all, thank you everyone for being here. I wanted to turn around and look at the amazing candidates we've got here tonight. And I know we're not supposed to clap, but please talk to them before you go. I really want to acknowledge our fellow candidates who are in the room, the organizers who put this on. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of headaches, trust me. And then also our grassroots and neighborhood leaders. So thank you all. And let's just start, and we can't cheer, but let's just start in our minds with a go team. Because the importance of this race, the importance of working together is critically important. So let's start that as our focus. My name is Jamie McLeod-Skinner. I'm looking to represent you in Congress. I was honored to be your nominee last cycle when we had one of the closest races in the country. I'm an engineer, attorney, small business owner, proud product of Oregon Public Schools, proud former union member. My grandparents built tractors. My mom's a retired teacher. And I have committed my life to public service. I've served 12 years in elected office in urban and rural areas. This is a time of crisis for so many, for families, for our environment, for our fundamental rights, including the right to reproductive health care and the right to abortion. And so it's a critical time that we flip the House and win that back. And my focus is bringing people together to create solutions. Those kitchen table issues of housing and health care and child care, retirement with dignity, as well as addressing the environmental crisis and those fundamental rights, protecting our democracy and our rights. We have a big job in November. It's critically important that we flip this seat and flip the House so we can lead our country forward and address the needs that we're seeing, not just for Oregonians, but for Americans, and really leading with our Oregon values. As mentioned, Oregon's 5th is critical to that happening, and we will need a united effort, and we will also need a candidate who can win this district that is partially in the metro area, but a lot of it, the majority of it, is actually outside the metro area. So being able to bridge that urban-rural divide, bring people together to win those votes, to serve the community well, that's what's really, that's what's key ahead of us. And so in terms of the Unite effort, I actually recommended a Keep It Clean pledge last year. That was not recognized and not welcomed, but I really wanted us to focus on winning in November, working together to do that. Winning outside the metro area, a little fun fact about Deschutes County, which is over a quarter of the voters, I've actually outperformed every Democrat running for president since 1964. So having those relationships in purple areas across the urban-rural divide is really key. But we know, and this is tough for all of us, that we see times when these races get contentious. And so just as a heads up, you're going to start seeing the hit pieces come against me next week. Just be a heads up for them. But I will say I'm proud of my lifetime of public service. I'm proud of serving with integrity, bringing people together to get things done. That's what I'm about. It's important when we see those to keep them in perspective and understand where they're coming from. It's unfortunate to see them in a primary and to be driven by folks you run against in the primary. It's a reality we have to face, but we're going to need to work together in the general to win this seat. And I look forward to working together to win this seat with all of you. Thank you.
I'm State Representative Janelle Bynum, and I'm running to represent the best of Oregon values in the halls of Congress. I first ran for office because I wanted to deliver for Oregon's children an education system that would allow them to achieve their dreams. I wanted to pass opportunity on. And as state representative, I delivered the Student Success Act with over $2 billion of continuous funding for Oregon students. In Congress, I'll deliver on full funding for special education, funding for housing, and funding for health care. As a working mom of four, I'm always talking about how I develop my ideas through the lens and experiences of my children. You'll hear more about that tonight. But friends, what we see happening in DC is chaotic. For us, it's a choice between democracy and autocracy. When Republicans here at home were choosing chaos with their walkouts in 2019, I was one of only 2 lawmakers here at home who were able to deliver to their communities that session. In 2020, during the George Floyd era, I led the legislature to deliver over 23 bipartisan bills on public safety and civil rights. In 2023, after having lost a big Intel plant to Ohio, I delivered the state's biggest investment. The Oregon CHIPS Act delivers $43 billion in economic activity for our state and over 6,000 jobs. In Congress, I will work with our entire federal delegation to deliver on the infrastructure, help for family farms, immigration reform, more jobs, and climate change policies our state needs. By electing me, the only candidate who has beaten Lori Chavez DeRemer, not once, but twice, you'll have a proven leader. As your next Congresswoman from Oregon, I'll deliver for you.
Thank you. We're going to be alternating the questioning order, so the first answer goes to Janelle. What do you think are the key issues on this district and the key issues that Congresswoman Chavez DeRemer is most vulnerable on?
I've been around this district and I've talked to people from the north to the south, and what they've told me is they want a leader that shares their values and a leader that has shown that. They've told me that housing is a key issue. They've told me that mental health supports and access to health care, including reproductive health care, is an issue for them. They've also told me that making sure that we protect small businesses, which includes family farms, those are the issues that unite us all. Where I think Lori Chavez DeRemer is most vulnerable is her position on reproductive rights and protecting them for military families. Oregonians have told us, and this is not just a Democratic issue or even simply a Republican issue, they've told us over and over again, they want Oregon to remain a place where reproductive rights access is open, it's unfettered, it's what people desire to have that access, and it shouldn't be shut off just for political reasons. So I think that's where Lori DeRemer is most vulnerable, and she's flip-flopped on the issue, and she can't be trusted, and that is why this election is so critical. We have to win back the House.
Jamie.
Yeah, it's kitchen table issues. So it's affordable housing, and I'm actually working on an affordable housing project now. I've got experience doing this from before. It's helping wildfire survivors find housing. I think I may be getting some feedback on this. Healthcare, both the physical and mental health care. Childcare, education. I believe in investing in education, and I propose actually a civilian GI Bill that will allow folks like our kids who are afraid of investing in themselves, they're afraid of going into debt, to actually be able to go into professions, apprenticeships as well, to make sure we have folks going into education and teachers and other key professions that we need folks in. The other thing is our environment, and the important thing about this to understand about this district is it bridges the urban-rural divide. It's got urban areas, it's got rural areas, and the solutions are different in different areas. Housing is one example. It's a different experience. We're all facing the climate crisis. It's real, it's here, and we have to address it. But the solutions are different in different places, and that's those real opportunities bridge divides. I've led wildfire recovery here in Oregon after a devastating wildfire. And then protecting our democracy, our fundamental rights, voting rights, reproductive rights, and also the right to organize. In terms of Lori, she is vulnerable, yes, on reproductive rights, also veterans' health care, food SNAP programs, so food security, environmental protection, she's terrible on that. Corporate PAC money, I don't take corporate PAC money because I believe in being accountable to Oregonians. And we fundamentally can't trust her, I absolutely agree on that statement.
Hey, you both talked about the reproductive rights and this. So I wonder if I could ask you a little bit more about what your priorities would be and what you would want Congress to do on the issue of reproductive rights. Jimmy.
We need to codify Roe. And that's both the access to abortion health care, it's also fertility treatment, IVF, it's also contraception. The push right now to have states' rights is really a cover for taking away rights. And if Republicans have majority and have the presidency, they will pass a national ban. So we're not safe here. The other thing about reproductive rights is a lot of people assume that everyone had them before Roe was overturned. We started with a land acknowledgement. Because of the Hyde Amendment, tribal communities, if you're dependent on Indian Health Services, you didn't have it before. If you're a member of the military, you didn't have it before. So truly expanding those rights. And so when we give land acknowledgements, we're actually serious about giving all those rights and establishing them. So we need to codify at the national level. This was a challenge last cycle in that Lori would go from debate to debate, literally claiming to be pro-choice one debate and not anti-choice the next debate. Now she's got a voting record. So it's going to be really easy to hold her feet to the fire on that. That was just not the case last year, and that made that a bit of a challenge. But when we talk about rights, we also, our bodily autonomy, it's also important to think about our protection against rape and our ability to challenge people when they have raped someone. That's something that's critical in this state. And respectfully, my colleague opponent was the lone legislator, Republican or Democrat, to vote against, and gave a floor vote, to vote against extending protections to rape victims to 7 years. That also indicates that protection of women's bodies and our fundamental rights.
Yeah.
Thanks. On reproductive health, I am the only person that has helped to deliver the Reproductive Health Equity Act when I first went into the legislature back in 2017. So I have a proven history of preserving women's rights and all people's rights to have the full range of reproductive health services. And what we did was we required insurance companies to cover abortion as a part of their policies without having to require very large copays and things like that. So that's real on the ground legislating, real on the ground protecting Oregonians. That's what I did here in Oregon, and that's what I'll do in Congress. Let me explain what that looks like on the ground. So I have a 22-year-old daughter, and again, I shared with you, I'll talk about my kids a lot because that's how I see things. I have a 22-year-old daughter who was looking for a dental school to go to. And so she had her choice of schools to pick from, Boston, Colorado, and here in Oregon. But when she was applying, she wanted to know where could she go that her reproductive rights would be protected. She was talking about this with her friend. And they were going to pick schools based on vibes. They were going to pick based on how much student debt they took on. But they also wanted to make sure that they were in a state where their reproductive rights were protected. She knew she could come home to Oregon because I had done the work to protect those rights. I'll do it again in Congress, and you can count on me over and over again to protect a woman's right to choose.
So we both talked about the diversity of the district. So I've got two questions from the two ends of it. In the bit of district that runs into Portland, homelessness is a crucial issue. So what do you see yourself doing in Congress to try to deal with the issue and to deal specifically with Oregon's problems with it? Janelle?
So I remember when I first got House District 39, the boundaries changed a little bit, and I would walk along the Multnomah-Clackamas County border and knock those doors. And families were very upset because they were seeing the ills of homelessness right in their backyard. And one thing I shared with them was that when I first got to the legislature, I worked on tiny homes. And I was upset a little bit with my colleagues because I didn't feel like they were moving fast enough on it. We were all going home safely to a home at night, but we had fellow Oregonians sleeping on the streets, and I didn't feel like we should normalize that. So I did the work to help bring tiny homes into our fold, make them legal, sorry, there's a, to make them legal and to make sure that we were doing everything possible to house people. I visited Redmond and their tiny home village. I've also invested in making sure that when the now governor had the bill about single-family home zoning, Oregon was a leader in this country in shifting from single-family home zoning to making sure that we can have all different types of homes in a community. So I've done the work here in Oregon, and I'll continue to do that work in Congress. I think Oregon is a leader in talking about houselessness. It's a leader in talking about the cost of housing, period. My daughter looked at school in Boston, and it was $3,000 a month just for a studio apartment. That is insane for someone who's 22 just trying to launch their career. It's not fair for our kids, and I want to deliver on a better future for them.
If I could remind folks to twist the little switch that turns your phones off for this occasion.
You heard his threats before. It applies to you guys as well. I'm just saying.
I just want to say it wasn't mine. Jamie?
So homelessness, it is across the district. We're having housing challenges across the district. The solutions are different in different areas. But it's everything from providing housing, long-term and short-term housing, as well as helping people with the challenges they're facing, those wraparound services. We're often finding mental health challenges, drug addiction. And you talk to drug addiction folks providing those services, they'll tell you housing is actually the number one issue, because when you've gone through the addiction process and you've essentially gotten off drugs, if you go back into the same housing, you essentially reinfect. So having those solutions, we need both short and long-term solutions. I'm working on an affordable housing project now. It's an affordable home ownership project in Southern Oregon as part of the carryover from the wildfire recovery work I was doing. So for wildfire survivors, and that's an issue in the district as well, in the Santiam area. I've also worked on affordable housing for teachers, because ask any real estate person what's the number one thing that people ask you about when they're buying homes, when they're looking at the value of the area, they're asking about teachers, so to help recruit. And also young people terming out of foster care. I've worked on this as a city planner, as a city manager, as a council member, as a vice mayor. And the federal tool is CDBG funds, so Community Development Block Grant funds. And smaller communities especially don't have the resources to have SDCs. Ask the people who work in local government about that. So we need to be investing in infrastructure, because one of the things that was a challenge for the legislature, we don't just build out, we need to build up, and we need better infrastructure capacity to do that. That's the federal government.
Okay, at the other end of the district, in the more rural parts, there are these considerable constant issues with wildfires and other natural disasters. What do you see yourself doing in Congress to greater assist Oregon in dealing with those? Jamie?
Yeah, well, and here, this is a bipartisan issue, because wildfire doesn't check party affiliation when it's burning down communities. And my guess, we can talk to plenty of people in Clackamas who are also talking and concerned about wildfire and smoke and the ice storms. So again, we need long-term and short-term solutions on this. The long-term is we need to get off the trajectory of destroying our planet. We need to invest in a long-term renewable energy grid, storage. We need to be investing in these things, and we have support. We've got great partnerships from labor. IDW is supporting me. I love the fact that they're looking at a just transition to renewable energy. We have those solutions. We just need to invest in them. And this is another area where Lori fell short, because we had some of that money in the bipartisan infrastructure bill that she carved out. In the short term, this is again work I'm doing now and I've done before, is helping to prepare people for wildfire. It's part of the work I do part-time for the state with the Office of Resilience and Emergency Management, working especially with diverse communities to help people be prepared for it, whether it's Cascadia or a wildfire or an ice storm. We need to be prepared. And then also recovery. So that's work I did in Southern Oregon, just less than 10 miles from where I finished high school, after the devastating 2020 wildfire that destroyed a third of the homes and businesses in the city of Talent. They brought me in as an interim city manager for a 6-month stint. I got millions of dollars in federal aid, so knowing how to access those resources is really key. One other point on that federal aid, it's the Stafford Act, so reauthorizing the Stafford Act is the money that goes to FEMA. We need to make sure it also includes heat domes, because that's an issue here in Oregon as well.
Janelle.
I'll put it in practical terms. We all know that wildfires and climate change, the issues of climate change are right here at our doorstep. So this is a really big district, but it's not confined to Deschutes County or Marion County. It's actually right here at home in Clackamas County. And just a few years ago, we had the impact of wildfires here. We remember our skies turning orange. My children actually have asthma, and we were going back and forth to the doctor's office trying to make sure that they could breathe. And I remember my husband and I coming home one day and realizing that we were going to have to leave. We had to make a choice between our children's health and staying here. And, we didn't have this idea of having a go bag, but we told the kids to pack up. My oldest daughter, packed up all of the pictures. I didn't know that was important to her. But this ritual of having to leave was really important. And then she packed a dress just in case we ended up in the South and she had to go to church, right? And so basically it told me that this was an idea, this was a concept, this was a thing that wasn't going to go away. And so what is really important is that we recognize the challenges of wildfires. We work with the federal government as a partner, and we also make sure that we hold our power companies accountable for any damage that they're doing, and we do the preventative maintenance that is absolutely necessary. So it's right here at home.
Janelle, if I could ask about other environmental issues that would be a priority to you and have touched the district, and what do you think people mean by the Green New Deal?
Well, I'm an engineer. I'm an electrical engineer who has experience in, my kids don't think I ever worked because they didn't know me then. I built electro-hydraulic power steering systems, and this was in order to reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions and increase the amount of fuel efficiency for vehicles. That was my first job out of college. What I've done in the legislature, just recently I introduced a Clean Energy Technology Manufacturing Hub bill, built on the same idea that we built the Semiconductor Chips Act bill on. And that was to really make Oregon the home for clean energy technology, make us the leaders, it provided us an opportunity to build business the way Oregonians build businesses. And so I think that that's really important, doing things on our terms rather than on other people's terms. So I've done that work. I passed legislation to permanently ban offshore drilling on the Oregon coast. And also I voted to require electricity providers make sure that they reduce greenhouse gas emissions as well. So I've done the work here in Oregon, and I'll continue to do that work and make sure that Oregon is a leader in clean energy manufacturing as a beacon for the rest of the country.
Yeah, and I just want to, I really appreciate the reference to go bags. I mean, my family had to pack a go bag to prepare because we faced having to have our home burned down, and there is that visceral feeling of looking around your home thinking you may never see things again, and what do you take? And that's what a lot of people have experienced, and that fear. I actually currently serve you now on the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, the OWEB board, and we work with farmers and ranchers across the state to invest our limited public resources into helping protect our natural resources and preserve them for generations to come. And I actually helped lead the climate resolution, this was a couple of years ago, to make sure that we're incorporating the climate impacts into the decision we're making about those resources. But I mentioned the renewable energy grid. This is also great economic development for our state because we've got a lot of, well, we have more sun in Central Oregon than you do here, I'll admit. But there's also the wind along the Columbia Gorge, and we can produce a lot of those green electrons and sell them out. It's fabulous for our economy. So this is also an economic development tool. The other thing we do on OWEB, and this is part of it as well, is clean water, clean air, renewable and sustainable soils. This is a huge issue for our farmers and ranchers. Their livelihoods depend on making sure that we have sustainability. And I've worked very closely in Central Oregon, where we've been struggling with drought for many years, with farmers and ranchers across the urban-rural land political divide, bringing people together to create solutions so that they can maintain their local economies in rural areas.
One other area where different parts of the districts might feel differently would be on gun safety. And I wonder if I could ask what your priorities would be in Congress and how you would reconcile the different parts of the 5th District to it. Jamie.
Well, first of all, I really appreciate you call it gun safety, because some of the greatest advocates of gun safety are responsible gun owners. My dad hunted to put food on the table. We, at the same time, we've also seen tragic impacts. My mom, as an educator, now retired, would tell me stories about the drills they would do, the active shooter drills. And her kids would look her right in the eye on those drills and say, if there was a shooter, would you stand between me and them? And she would look them in the eye and say yes. And she would. I know her. She would. And so those impacts, making sure that we don't have weapons of war in the hands of young kids, making sure there are background checks, and there's also permitting that's involved. Heck, if anyone who drove here needs a license to drive here. There are common sense solutions we can work together with responsible gun owners on to move these things forward. My father-in-law was a rancher from Eastern Oregon, and so there is a more of a common practice of having guns in rural areas. Part of that also is for safety. If you call 911 here, what's it take the police? 5, 10, 15 minutes? Where we live, it takes 45 minutes or an hour, just because the sheriff, it's a larger area. So those issues I think are real important. And then also red flag laws for domestic violence. And also, when I was a kid, in high school, someone I knew, we played basketball together in a neighboring high school, she was struggling with depression. She found her dad's gun. She took her life. The highest rate, the number one cause of loss of life is actually taken by oneself, and that's something we need to address as well.
Janelle?
Sure. I grew up in a very violent time in Washington, D.C. during the 90s, early 80s, 90s. And one of the things I remember was not being really able to go outside. There's a park. I went home a few months ago, and there was a park right down the street, and it had children in it. And I remember in that park when I was growing up, it didn't have children in it. We couldn't go there because it was so violent. And so what I bring to this is this perspective that I will never allow my community to be so violent that our children can't go to school, that our children can't learn, that our children can't play in our parks. And so I think gun violence looks different in different communities. I fortunately have the perspective of understanding that in areas where there's economic depression, it looks different. There's gang violence and there's hopelessness. There are also communities where it looks like a lot of mental health challenges. And so in the legislature, I brought forth an $80 million package to help grow the number of mental health providers, which was in response to school administrators and educators and parents around the state saying we need more help for our children. And then also it worked with Moms Demand Action to close the boyfriend loophole and also to fund the Oregon State Police background checks program. I've done the work. I've lived the horrors of gun violence, and I'll continue to do that work in Congress. No one has the same record that I do.
In this district, as in every district, there are infrastructure needs, and part of a congressman's job is bringing the federal government to fit some of them. What would be your priorities? And considering the general feeling about tolling, how do you see paying for them? Janelle?
So infrastructure is something that we learned was very important in doing the semiconductor work and the CHIPS Act. We were working with a lot of environmental organizations who said, you're going to build, you're going to need housing, you're going to build in these industrial areas, but we have all of this land and we don't want to expand our urban growth boundary. What do? Well, the real trick is you have to make sure that this infill land that we already have is usable. And that comes from building infrastructure. So what is infrastructure? It's roads, it's water, it's sewer, it's broadband, it's electricity. It's all of those things that make our land actually usable. I've sponsored the Broadband Act here in Oregon. I've made sure that we've provided, when we were doing in 2016 a large transportation package, I made sure that Powell Boulevard had the infrastructure that it needed. Going forward, we have a new infrastructure package, a transportation package coming up this next legislative session, and I encourage everyone to engage there. What the federal government, what the federal delegation's job is is to bring that money back home so that we can tackle our housing problem. We can make sure our economy grows at a reasonable rate, and we can make sure that we are environmental stewards and build on the land that we already have.
Amy?
So just respectfully, I believe that Janelle, Lori, and I would all tell you that congressmen could also be a congresswoman, just to make that point. But on infrastructure, there's actually both physical and social infrastructure. As a civil engineer, I've done some of this work. I actually designed water and sanitation systems in rural Kosovo when I was working there in post-war recovery. But the points made about utilities, that's needed. Housing, transportation, those are all the things we typically think about for infrastructure, and those are major investments. This is also where we see the division on urban-rural divide, because small communities can't raise enough taxes to actually do it. So that those major, and that was a bipartisan infrastructure bill, those major allocations need to be done at the federal level. But there's also social infrastructure, and as a small business owner, I can tell you, childcare, healthcare, these are things that we need to be also thinking about as we're thinking about the overall structure, because they also factor into whether or not our economies grow and communities can thrive. Education as well. I believe strongly in investing in education. And if we're thinking about holistic systems, holistic communities where families can thrive and businesses can thrive, especially small businesses, we need to be thinking about this in the bigger sense, and also thinking about both the physical infrastructure, but also as, when I was in Bosnia and Kosovo, I was in charge of reconstruction of buildings, the sticks and bricks. And a colleague of mine worked on what was called psychosocial. And the sticks and bricks were important, but it's the people also live inside those buildings that are critically important. And that's part of infrastructure, I believe.
Okay, I'll try to get a little more careful on that general. If I can get a little more specific on that question.
Yeah.
I wonder how you folks feel about replacing the interstate bridge, what you'd like to see happen, what you'd like to see the feds pay for, and how you would cover the rest of it. Jamie?
Yeah, it's a partnership. And so, and so there needs to be state, federal, communities locally are impacted. I know that tolling is a huge issue in this area, and I do think that there needs to be an awareness of impacts. And we're seeing, and I can say this as a city manager, city planner, if there's tolling that forces people off of the interstate through communities, there's health and safety issues for communities. You have to then rebuild because your roads are impacted. So we need the infrastructure in place. We also need to know that we've got the potential of Cascadia, or actually when Cascadia happens, we will need to be able to move people and products across areas. And so making sure that we've got sufficient size bridges so that we can move large vehicles across. We also need to make sure we're promoting sustainable use and multi-transportation modes on those bridges. So there needs to be a holistic look at it. There also need to look at the impacts we've had on communities in terms of where major infrastructure has been placed. That all needs to be factored into that discussion. But the federal government absolutely has a role in that. And especially now, we are seeing a time when we've got to move on this bridge, otherwise we're not going to move. So I think making sure everyone's stepping up is doing that. And lastly, I'll say this on tolling. A good friend of mine served in the legislature in Washington State, and she said it's not tolling yes or no, it's where you toll in terms of getting those resources. And I think that's something that needs to be part of the discussion.
Yeah.
I think this is a question more on the bigger issue of economic development and what we want our state to look like and how we can be economically resilient. How we can make sure that Oregon doesn't go like this and we have to cut back on very important services for the most vulnerable in our state. Just today it came up, I'm not sure if you're following this in the paper, but our container terminal is shutting down. And that container terminal is a lifeline for a lot of small Oregon family businesses. They export hay, alfalfa, teriyaki sauce. Those types of things are happening right before us. So whether you're talking about the interstate bridge, whether you're talking about I-5, whether you're talking about 205, whether you're talking about Portland International Airport, it is really important that we have someone that understands how important it is to move goods and services and people around our state. And that to me is a non-negotiable in terms of what's really important for our state. I think an advocate in Washington should be someone who understands the impact and has the relationships and the understanding of why this is important for Oregon and why it's non-negotiable. Ultimately, I think that we have to make investments. This country has not made the proper investments in our roads, in our bridges for years. And we are going to leave our children with decrepit infrastructure, and I believe that that's unacceptable. I'm the person that will deliver on that for Oregonians.
Right now, and for the past several months, the House has twisted knots on the question of military aid to Ukraine and to Israel. I'd like to ask you how you would be voting on that issue.
I fully support aid to Israel and to Ukraine.
Yeah, this is pretty straightforward. I'm right there with Janelle. But let me just say that I actually would be the only one, not just in this race, but really in the delegation, who has international experience. I began my public service over in Bosnia and Kosovo just after the war, working for a humanitarian organization and rebuilding schools and hospitals so refugees could return home. So I've seen the impact of war. The other thing that we're facing, and I'll talk about them just briefly separately, in the Ukraine, we've got, frankly, a madman in Putin who it will not stop there. And so what we're looking at is if we don't invest right now in helping Ukraine defend itself, we will ultimately see the potential for our soldiers having boots on the ground. Part of me hates the thought of sending that money over when we have affordable housing needs. We have so many needs here in this country, but the reality is it is pennies to the dollar in terms of the costs that we will bear if we evolve into World War III. With regard to Israel, Israel is a long-term, important, that's a very special relationship we have. So Israel being able to defend itself and protect itself is critically important. Our investment in the Iron Dome, we saw that impact when Iran tried to attack just recently. We have invested in the Iron Dome to help Israel protect itself. So those investments are important. But we also, this is very important, Israel should not be able to use our weapons to harm civilians. And so both of those can be true, that we can be very committed to our partner in the Middle East in a very dangerous area, helping Israel protect itself, while also protecting civilians.
Again, we go a little deeper on that. There's a great deal of concern among Democrats in this district and around the country about the way the war in Gaza is going and the way American weapons are being used. I mean, are there particular limitations you would use? Is there a way that would be reflected in the way you would vote? Jamie.
Just to say it's horrific. The horror of October 7th has evolved into the horror of what's going on in Gaza right now. And what we're seeing also take place here in this country. So we must stop anti-Semitism. We must stop Islamophobia. I have a long track record of working in social justice and protecting both communities. When I served on a city council in Silicon Valley, there was a large mosque there, and it was right after 9/11 when the Muslim community was being attacked. And so standing in solidarity with people who are Americans and need to be protected as Americans. My dad's Jewish, and so making sure that we protect and preserve and make sure that civilians can survive and be protected is critically important. So we do need peace for Jews and Palestinians. It's also a tremendously dangerous region. So we talked before about making sure we protect Israel and the right for Israel to exist, because some of the pushback we're seeing right now is to destroy the state of Israel. I will stand absolutely shoulder to shoulder with Israel to protect the state of Israel. That said, I think when U.S. weapons are used, they cannot be used to harm civilians. To fight against Hamas and the terrorist organization of Hamas, absolutely, but not having civilians be caught in the crossfire. And I think, frankly, we've had our last president is someone who I didn't agree with. We're having I hear from a lot of Jewish folks who do not agree with Netanyahu. I think he has crossed a red line in terms of the harm to civilians. And I think we need to be able to say that you cannot use our weapons to harm civilians and have that red line established.
Yeah.
As I mentioned in the beginning, I think it's really important for us to, as the adults in the room, to think about, okay, what is the present state and what are we passing on to our children? So when I was 15, I did a youth ambassador trip to Japan. And the way that was set up the reason that was set up was because the United States and Japan had once been mortal enemies, right? This also was a program that operated in Germany. And what they believed was that if young people, if students could be diplomats with one another, we would de-escalate and we would not have the wars that we're seeing now. Ultimately, we know that war costs. It costs human lives, and in particular, what's really hard for me as a mother is to see children being harmed. Whether they're war is being normalized in their mind, or they're actually experiencing having to hide out in bunkers, whether they're being killed in numbers. And I believe that we should acknowledge the lives of Palestinian children that are being harmed. And so I think ultimately in Congress, what I will advocate for is more diplomacy, more opportunities to de-escalate, because normalizing war is not something that I feel comfortable that we should continue to engage in. We have to do better, and we have to ask more questions ahead of time.
Healthcare coverage in this country has expanded, but is still spotty and is receding now after the end of the pandemic. What would be your priorities on expanding it, and would you be looking toward an ultimately single-payer system? Janelle?
So that daughter that's graduating from college in just a few weeks asked me, how much longer do I have on my health insurance with you? And I told her, until you're 26. But you know what? It wasn't always that way, right? So we've been fortunate with Obamacare to be able to expand that opportunity for young people. But the truth of the matter is, I believe that it's a fundamental human right. I've voted for that time and time again. Under Senator Manning's leadership, he has continued to work on that for the Oregon legislature. I made sure that we voted, that we passed Cover All Kids, and made sure that we provided for immigrants as well. I'll continue to do that in this country, because one thing we also know is that we are losing healthcare providers day by day. So again, this 22-year-old kid who wants to launch out into the world to be a dentist, oh, by the way, she chose OHSU because the cost in different places, one of them got up to $600,000. So student debt for medical providers is eating us out of the medical provider core that we should be building. One thing that we absolutely need to make sure of is that we have additional spaces and we provide residencies so that we grow the number of doctors. You know, match day, not everybody matches. We all want someone to care for us as we age. So I think that that's important, making sure that we have a number of providers, and making sure that we don't eat our kids out of house and home with the student debt that they incur to become a medical provider.
Amy?
Well, Oregon's been a leader on this, and this goes back to Governor Kitzhaber. And we should be sharing, we're doing and voting rights as well, and voting access. Oregon has been a leader. We may be a small state, but we're doing some pretty amazing things here. So we do need to expand, and it's both physical and mental health care. Both of those components are critically important. So on physical health care, everyone needs core physical health care services. We're the only industrialized nation in the world that doesn't provide, and it costs us more not to in the long run. There's pharmacy benefit managers. There's all sorts of ways we can save money. So ultimately, I believe we need to get to the point where everyone's covered. There's also great models internationally where you have both a public component of full coverage and then also a private component for those who want those Cadillac systems. That's a big deal for a lot of unions to be able to negotiate a higher program. So those public-private partnerships, several countries have them. We would develop our own. But a core and a baseline of services for everyone is something that I think we need to get to. And whether we're able to get to it in short term or work towards it by doing some of the cost savings to make sure that we can fund it, because ultimately we got to pay our bills. But there are ways to do it. There's models out there. On mental health care, this is also comprehensive health care is critically important. We're seeing this with veterans, with seniors, with students. I'm really proud We're here in Oregon City. One of the youth advisors advises me personally, and he's working on mental health right here in the city with his colleagues. And then also, I mentioned before, the civilian GI Bill, so we can get people into the profession debt-free so they can then serve in this capacity.
Again, a little more specific on that. The problem of a shortage of medical providers and shortage of medical resources in hospitals is particularly crucial in rural areas of the district. Specifically, what do you see the federal government being able to do to deal with that, Jamie?
You queued up the continuation because I had stopped the last question. Thank you. So I've talked for a while about a civilian GI Bill. The idea is that if you like our kids who are afraid of going into debt, and a lot of folks are in this position now because debt is just backbreaking for so many folks. So you'd sign a promissory note, and then you get your education debt-free, and then afterwards, so it's the flip of military service, then afterwards you work where you're needed. In rural areas, this is a huge issue, but in inner cities, there's places across our country that are struggling with this. So for healthcare providers, they could tap into the civilian GI Bill. It's true for educators as well, and a lot of other key professions where we're not getting folks going into the profession because they're afraid of going into debt. So there's many other ways to deal with student debt as well, but that's just one area where we solve the problem before it's created, and we get folks who then, once they have the degree, once they're working in a place, they've got a certain number of years to work until they've essentially paid it off, then they can work wherever they want. But then we get the providers we need, and this is a big issue in Central Oregon right now. We get the providers we need where we need them, and then also we'll be able to help folks go into the professions that we need them in. And there are individual small programs like this, but this would be a more comprehensive program.
Yeah.
One of my daughter's essays for applying to dental school was, I never thought I would include prison in my career path, but here I am. And she actually worked at the Oregon State Prison, and she worked at McLaren Youth Center, and in their dental clinics during COVID, because nobody else would take a young aspiring dentist. And what she learned about was the SHOWI program. And we have been funding in Oregon a program that's the Health Services Corps that mirrors the federal program. So we're already doing this to help ensure that we have a strong pipeline. What, of course, is important is that we expand that program. And so basically, you go to your school for X number of years, and you get your tuition paid for. And so we actually, the Bynums, have a spreadsheet based on Tufts and OHSU and how much year one costs and how much year two costs, and if she gets the SHOWI scholarship or if she gets the National Health Services Corps scholarship, which is the federal government similar scholarship, how much would she owe and how quickly can she pay down her debt? So these programs are already in place. We just need more money to fund them. You work 2 years, you get your tuition paid for 2 years, you work 2 years. If it's paid for 4 years, then you work for 4 years. And I think that is what is going to help save the country, is making sure that we reduce the financial burden on our young kids going into serving, whether it's in mental health. You can use these if you're a doctor or a dentist or a mental health provider, or even a nurse, and it's for rural areas as well.
Well, another crushing family expense in Oregon is childcare, where Oregon is among the least affordable places in the country and costs as much as college tuition. What do you see the federal government is doing about that, and what would be your priorities?
Yeah, my kids went to Valley View Day School right up the street on Sunnyside Road, and I remember we had 4, and at one point all 4 were in daycare, and we went to pay the bill, and the director was like, "Is that right?" And she had to go look it up because it was over $2,000, which is more than what I was making. And as I thought about it, bringing that perspective of a working mom whose full paycheck, you know how they call Whole Foods whole paycheck? The daycare is whole paycheck too. When I think about that compromise that people are making, maybe they're not able to invest in a home, maybe they're not able to repair their car the way they need to because they're covering childcare. That is a real challenge. So one of the things I'm really excited about is the work that I did with Representative Walters on passing the CHIPS child care bill, which was a follow-up to the Oregon CHIPS Act, where we invested in childcare resources and funding for families to be able to go into and support the semiconductor industry. We knew that we had to educate our workforce, but we also had to provide more opportunities to build childcare centers and capacity in the state. We just don't have enough capacity for people to take their kids and earn a fair day's work. So that's what I would continue to do, that program at the federal level.
Jamie.
Yeah, I mentioned this before as part of our social infrastructure. I've met too many people who want to go into certain work, take certain jobs, but they can't afford to take the job and also provide childcare. This is a huge issue in the trades, where especially if you have single parents who will have a project they want to work on that starts at an early time, or they can't get childcare in that location. And so this is really fundamental to investment in our economy and making sure our economy is strong. Last night, actually, I had dinner with a bunch of folks after the forum we had in Bend, and a small business owner who had an incubator site that was developing small business ownership, especially in the high-tech services, was saying that he was having problems, and that's like one of the number one issues that comes up. In Central Oregon at the community college there, and talking to the president of the university, I thought it was going to be talking about tuition costs. So the two issues were affordable housing and childcare for students. So this impacts everywhere. So we do need to be making investments in this and looking also at creative programs, funding as part of other programs, but recognizing where the gaps are. Again, this is about economic development. This is an urban and rural issue. And they're actually doing a really creative program in Central Oregon, having lived on a farm as a kid, I love this, where they actually, part of daycare was kids coming out and getting to play with and take care of critters, goats and chickens and sheep. And it's a very rural flavor to it, but it's also learning great skills. I mean, FFA is learning those types of skills. So we need to be investing in making sure across the divide and the district we're getting those investments.
We've talked a lot this evening about more money to spend, at a time when the federal deficit is a larger and larger part of the economy, at a time when both Social Security and Medicare are approaching insolvency, but running out of money. How do you see dealing with the overall financial situation of the federal government and the things that it brings in and what it needs to spend?
Yeah.
Amy.
No, this is huge, because I talked about kitchen table issues before, and that's that same mentality. We all know that there's a certain amount that comes in, there's only a certain amount that can go out. And let me actually just talk about SSI real quickly. One of the things we can do there to avoid insolvency is either raise or remove the cap. That will pay for it, and that will address that issue. But also in terms of overall for our economy, we need to build more stuff again. We need to have a trade surplus. And so, having strong unions is good for the economy. We talked about childcare. If people can't go to work, that's bad for the economy. And especially here in Oregon, 50% of our business are small businesses. And I'm talking small businesses like mine, a couple of employees or just working as your own consultancy. I'm not talking about hundreds of employees. That's a big business. It's a different definition. But if for small businesses, making sure that they can offer health care and be competitive. So if we have comprehensive health care that's provided, and there are ways to cut those costs now, it actually bolsters and strengthens the economy. So we need to be thinking about this in the big picture and the larger perspective of ultimately what comes in and what goes out. But we can be making some smarter decisions about what goes out that helps the bottom line of what comes in. And then lastly, I'll say, 20 years ago, I was elected to a city council, and I've always said, I don't believe in spending public money. I don't believe in spending public money. I believe in investing it. And so I always, even at the city council level, I had a Republican neighbor, and my game I play with myself is I'd have to go and knock on his door and say, I just signed a check on your behalf and here's why. We always need to be able to answer that here's why question.
Janelle.
So as a member of the legislature, we always had to have a balanced budget. So I have that experience over and over again. We couldn't spend more than we had. And then when we didn't get the calculations right, we have the kicker. Now it's controversial, of course, what the kicker does for the state and how it challenges our finances. But the simple principle is that we know we can't spend a dollar twice. And I think having that experience and having that know-how and taking that to Washington to make sure that when we're having budget conversations, we're recognizing that every dollar that we overspend is a debt that we're passing on to our children. And that, to me, challenges our sense of fiscal responsibility. What I also think is really important is that everyone pays their fair share. So it's not fair for me to have to go to work every day, toil, and then other people have passive income and they don't pay the same tax rate that regular working people pay. That for me is a real challenge, especially when, people are trying to put food on the table, they're trying to keep a roof over their heads, they're trying to pay for their prescription drugs, they're trying to pay for their kids' college education, or maybe they're paying their loans back. I think Americans know that they only have $1 to spend once, and they need elected people to recognize that same thing.
This has been perhaps the least productive Congress in anyone's memory.
We both agree.
Divided into hardline, partisan sectors, and nothing seems to be produced at all. Now, say a freshman congresswoman, you wouldn't have a whole lot to say about that, but what would be your priorities, and how do you think you could begin to deal with that? Janelle?
Well, I'm really excited to take my first vote to make Leader Jeffries Speaker Jeffries, and I think that'll be part of the solution, number one. I'm really excited about promoting democracy. It's really important to me to make sure that we maintain an engaged electorate, that people can rely on the people that they've sent to Washington. And so I'm excited to vote on the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. And I'll just tell you, the less we pay attention to democracy, the more it erodes. And the example I can give you, so my daughter went away to college. I asked her if she wanted to vote here in Oregon or if she wanted to change her registration to Georgia. And she was like, no Georgia for me. But it was a really consequential election. It was, Warnock, Nossoff, I think Stacey Abrams, very consequential. So a serious consideration for her. But what she explained was that they had to stand outside. They didn't, it wasn't really clear on how you could get an early voting ballot. You couldn't get any water. People couldn't give you food. It was a whole thing. And so she said, I prefer to vote the way Oregonians vote. And I think the efforts that we have to make voting at home national across the country, I think is a worthwhile endeavor. And I'll be excited to vote for that as well.
Yeah, there's some of those big picture fundamental rights. We talked about abortion and codifying Roe, voting, also the Equality Act, the PRO Act, to make sure we're supporting our working people and we're building our economy and the strength of our economy. Investing in our environment, we talked earlier about some of those long-term and short-term decisions and investments, but I would anticipate spending most of my time on kitchen table issues, on housing and healthcare and education, investing in education. Again, another investment in our economy long-term. There are some big picture votes that'll come up, and they're pretty straightforward. The Equality Act, the Voting Rights Act, voting on abortion rights. But there's also small steps we can be taking in terms of reauthorization. And so this is an area where, Lori currently serves in the Ag Committee. The Farm Bill has not been reauthorized. 3/4 of the Farm Bill is about food security. And when some of those SNAP programs expired, food insecurity across our state shot up dramatically. So just making those investments, and yes, that is spending out, but come on, kids shouldn't be punished for their folks not being able to provide for them. Our folks in our communities are starving. And so the reauthorization of the Farm Bill and both working on healthy natural resources, working with our farm communities, some of the work I do right now with OWEB, but also that food security. And food security is both having access to food and having be healthy food. And there are small family farmers in Central Oregon who are working on the healthy component of that farm to table, which is really key. And I had another comment, but my time is up.
Well, okay, I'm going to give you a chance to make it. One issue that I want to talk some more about on this is this whole question of hunger, in which Oregon has for many years had a really horrific position among the other states in the country. And I'd like to ask what you would do specifically, what your priorities would be in addressing the question of hunger in Oregon in Congress. Jane?
Well, like on anything, there's the direct and there's some of those more indirect issues. On the direct, making sure we reauthorize the Farm Bill. It has not been, it expired last year. We need to reauthorize it and recognize and bolster SNAP programs. And then also make sure SNAP programs are investing in and encouraging healthy foods. That's a real key piece. And so that would be a top priority. But there's also some of the work we're doing with farmers and ranchers. This also impacts climate issues because of transportation. So there's some really creative work being done in Central Oregon, again, farm to table, addressing, providing healthy food for families. There's also other impacts we're seeing down in Lynn County, the corporate chicken farms. So, you know, here in Oregon, ag is seeing like 10 to 15% of our economy, an important part of our economy. But also we're seeing the corporatization that's happened across the country starting to happen here. So over 95% of our farms are family farms here in Oregon. And we're seeing corporations now come in, buy up land, and then the corporate chicken farms essentially impacting negative impacts on our soil and water, but it's also fundamentally changing the structure of communities when these corporations buy out. And Republicans, conservative Republicans, are now raising this and coming to Democrats. I was at a meeting, a Lynn County Dem meeting in December, where there's someone from the Farm Bureau who came to the Democratic meeting and said, can you please help us on this issue? These are bipartisan issues if we work together as Oregonians. That's our tradition, that's what I'm proud of, and that's what we can do in Congress.
Yeah.
Could you recenter the question for me?
The question is, what did you see yourself doing in Congress to deal with the hunger issue, which has been fairly horrific in Oregon for decades?
Thank you. So my mom grew up in the segregated South, one of 8 kids. And one of the things that she reminds me of is that she remembers, so she graduated high school in 1970. She remembers when the school lunch program was initiated. And she remembers being very happy because she had learned to go all day without eating. And this only came up because she would watch my kids, and you know, you grandparents do whatever you do when you have the grandkids. Yeah, I've been told to butt out. But I was like, Mom, why are the kids eating like 8 o'clock at night? And she wasn't fazed by it, but it was because she had learned to go all day. And that was something that, and she told me when I got elected, she said, make sure that you protect children eating. Make sure that they have a full stomach as they're trying to learn. My mother and father are educators. And so one of the things we did was, you know, they used to call it free and reduced lunch. We took away reduced lunch and we just made it free lunch for kids at school here in Oregon. We also are seeing in the news today that, you know, there's conversation about whether to provide money for summer lunch programs. I don't understand why feeding children is a challenge for Republicans. I just don't get it. I don't understand why that's criminal, and I don't understand why that's even a thought. So I would be an advocate for making sure that we provide it or continue to provide those summer lunch funds that started during COVID.
So it's nothing that we want to think about, but it's not unimaginable that either of you could be a freshman congresswoman in the minority next session. So if that were the case, how do you see yourself managing to do anything and managing to advance your own interests in a Republican House of Representatives? Janelle?
I think having been born as a minority in this country has made me very adept, and having developed a penchant for leadership has made me adept at navigating rooms where I look different or I think differently, right? It's not always my race. Sometimes it's my ideology, right? And so what I've learned in the legislature is that you try to combine forces with people who have the very same interests that you have. So just recently, I had what you might have described as a mortal enemy, who was one of my colleagues in the legislature. Always a diplomat. And so he and I differed, just could not be more different on a particular issue. And I had to make the decision that I still wanted to pass legislation and I still wanted to deliver for Oregonians. And so he and I came together. Now you're going to figure out who he is. We came together to pass a bill on small business and making sure that businesses didn't carry the liability for cities and counties unfairly. And I wake up thinking about that all the time. I disagreed with this representative wholeheartedly, but I knew that if I was going to be effective, I was going to have to work with him. And he knew if he wanted his bill passed, he was going to have to work with me. And I've always maintained that stance that I will be a diplomat. I will always put the people first. It's not about me, it's the people.
Jamie?
Yeah, I've actually, in my 12 years elected office in urban and rural areas, I've actually always been in the political minority. And it can be challenging, but the real gift of that is you learn the craft. You don't have the opportunity to just throw elbows. If you're in the majority, you can get your way. I mean, we've seen walkouts in the state, we've seen all sorts of issues. So actually having to develop the relationships, understand your colleagues and what their motivations are, and how you can develop joint solutions with them is something I've learned, whether it's in rural Central Oregon, whether it's in Silicon Valley, so from high tech to rural communities. And I'm really grateful for that time and that experience because you do learn that skills. I'm also really proud that my colleagues have consistently asked me to lead them. So on the Jefferson County Education Service District Board, my mostly Republican but also Democratic colleagues selected me as chair. And when I went down to work for 6 months as the interim city manager to do wildfire recovery in Southern Oregon, they actually changed the date of the meeting so that I could stay on as chair. And we were holding those meetings virtually. It was during the time of COVID. So during the time of COVID, our kids were at risk. But in rural, conservative Central Oregon, I worked with my colleagues to actually pass a racial justice and equity policy. Now, we stayed away from buzzwords. We just talked about the safety and the needs of our kids, of our educators, of our communities. And we were able to move that forward. So that was, and I led that as chair. On OWEB, I've been co-chair of the Water and Climate Committee, vice mayor when I served on the city council.
Well, this is something that we really don't want to think about, but it's not unimaginable that one of you would be a freshman congresswoman next year in the second Trump administration. So, if I could ask you a little bit about what kind of challenges that might propose and how you see yourself responding to them, Jamie.
Well, when you're playing defense, you have to protect fundamental rights. I mean, that would be terrifying for our country. And shout out to all our neighborhood leaders, anyone who's knocking on doors and conservatives making calls. That's also why we must work together as a team in the general. It's imperative because we need to flip the House. We need to hold the Senate if we can, and we must defeat Donald Trump. That is, if we want our democracy to continue, that is just fundamental to that. But I will say it's gotten tougher with more divisive. But going back to the last question, that divide, I think of Liz Cheney, and I would love to serve with her and argue with her till I was blue in the face on all sorts of policy issues. But when it came to protecting our democracy, I would stand shoulder to shoulder with her. And this is a time for renewed patriotism. When I served in Bosnia and Kosovo, I was young, I had this epiphany. And I looked around, we can all talk about the problems we have with our democracy, but I looked around and saw the alternative on the ground in a former war zone. And I came to believe in that moment that we have the greatest imperfect form of government. The imperfect means we've got to get involved. But the greatness of our nation is that we are founded not on a common bloodline, but on common beliefs in democracy, in freedom, in justice. That's what we need to rally people around and keep that as a focus so we can disagree on policy. I've been in plenty of those boards, but we need to come together around fundamental beliefs in being Americans.
Janelle?
One of the things that I'm known for is my constituent services. And in light of the fact that maybe we won't be able to pass our agenda at the federal level, there's still work that we can do here at home to make sure that the things that we need to happen and for our young people, for our seniors, actually happen. So in my office, I prioritize my constituents. If they come into the building, they absolutely get a meeting. If young people are applying to, say, college, Naval Academy, whatever it is, we make sure that every young person that asks for a letter of recommendation gets one. We also manage, we had a case where we were working with the Portland Water Bureau and trying to make sure that a constituent, it was an old constituent, I didn't even serve her anymore in House District 39, but she was from 51 and she knew that I would stand up for her. We worked through their water metering challenge. We are also working through cases right now with the employment department, and my staff is giving me an update every single day on the number of cases we have, how we're advocating for them, and we did that during COVID. So even if you're not in the driver's seat, there are still ways that you can show up for your constituents each and every day. That's right here at home. Of course, in Washington, you stand up and you fight and you throw rocks. What I think is most important is that we not ever get in that situation again, which requires us to vote.
Both of you have been involved in politics and in public issues for a long time. I wonder if I can ask if there's someone who strikes you, who sees you as a model, someone you could want to aspire to as you look forward to what the next step in your career might be. Janelle.
You know, my grandmother was a hotel maid, and I think about how even though she had basically a 6th grade education, she was still a diva. She was still a very proud woman. She articulated very clearly, and she was a member of the Hotel Workers Union. And my fondest picture of her is her walking in the March on Washington. And I think even though my grandmother did not have the privilege of a formal education, she understood what it meant to be civilly active. She understood what it meant to stand up even if you lose. She understood what it meant to have an education. And so if I do this work, of course, in service to our children, and that is my #1 goal. But I also do it in service to women like Maddie Brown, my grandmother, Fannie Lou Hamer, who was bludgeoned basically and fought for her rights to vote, and women who initiated the Montgomery bus boycott, women who had nothing but had everything and understood that democracy was the key to their freedom.
Jamie.
Yeah, much respect to moms. My mom was a single mom with 2 kids when she was young. She became a single mom for safety of our family. She'd get up early, drive a school bus. She'd teach all day. She drove a school bus home. In the summer, she was a farm worker. And that commitment to family, she always stayed positive and energetic and told us, always leave the world better than you found it. Always leave a place better than you found it. That level of optimism and commitment to community is something, I always consider myself a pale version of my mom. I aspire to her passion and dedication to public service. I also am really proud of our Oregon values. I mean, I think of folks like Tom McCall. I think of Wayne Morris. Folks who are not afraid to say, this is what's right for our community. It's not about partisanship. It's about how do we work together to get things done. I mean, we're the envy of other states on the West Coast because we have public access to our beaches. Our land use laws that were established, this is our identity as Oregonians, is something to be really proud of. And then also, as a kid, when I was little, my mom took a teaching job in Tanzania, and so I lived in East Africa for a while. And it was during the time that Nelson Mandela was in prison, and he was in prison for opposing apartheid. And it was later, when I was in college, that he was let out of prison. And I remember being so inspired, because then he became president, of course, but he also led his country through an incredibly divisive time. And this is the times we're in right now. Through that divisive time, it could have broken into bloodshed and war, but he led his country to forward and past apartheid, and for folks to work together into that country. It's inspiring.
We could close by coming toward the campaign a little bit. I want to each of you can tell us a little about where your campaign money is coming from, if there's some money you wouldn't take, and if there's ways you would improve the American campaign finance system. Jamie.
You're speaking to my heart. In my 20 years, the 12 years in elected office and 20 years, I've never taken corporate PAC money because I believe ultimately that you should not be able to buy votes. The influence that corporations and given folks money has is huge. And so I've not taken it. It means you have to work a bit harder, but also it's from Oregonians. I mean, even this last cycle, Janelle raised more money than I did, but I raised more than she did here in Oregon. And, I think 21% of hers was from Oregonians, 72% of mine was. I'm really proud of that support throughout the district because that's that trust and accountability. People need to know that when you are in those closed door meetings advocating on their behalf, that they can trust you. So I don't think there should be stock trading for members of Congress. I think corporate finance laws are incredibly important, but not taking corporate PAC money defines who you are, and that's one of the reasons why I've been up, 30 plus points in multiple polls across the district because of those relationships, showing up, meeting folks, building relationships throughout the district, but also establishing that trust, understanding the issues, but being committed to being accountable to everyday Oregonians. I'm really proud of that track record. I'm passionate about it. And I think it's a really important consideration for folks. But I think we need more of those protections in Congress to make sure that ultimately those representing folks are accountable to voters. And it's also voters in the district, not someone sticking from outside putting their thumb on the scale.
Yeah.
Well, I'm proud to have voted for the Oregon legislature. We just passed campaign finance reform here in Oregon. And I remember in my first campaign, it was over $1 million, and it made me feel kind of icky. Because I felt like, how many children could we feed with $1 million? That was practically how I felt about it. But what I also recognized was that it was one of maybe five or six districts in the state that was actually competitive. So they look different. And my first race was $1.1 million. The second was $865,000 just on my side. I think the third race was during COVID, and this most recent race I think was close to $1 million as well. So there's been a lot of money invested in making sure that Democrats maintain the majority here in Oregon, and that means that we've been able to pass a lot of good legislation. But I think nationally what's really important is that people feel like they can engage without having to buy a vote. I'm really proud that 80% of my funds came from Oregon and made sure that I actually have canvassed all over the country because people see what type of leader I am. And they understand that when you have good people in Congress, when you have leaders that understand how to legislate, that have the experience, when their district isn't competitive, they can invest in a district that is. So not only do they give, they phone bank, but they make sure that the strongest leader wins. And I would encourage you to vote for me.
Well, we're coming up to 8 o'clock, so our last question to look to the future a little bit be what would you see as your priorities in committee assignments, and what do you think you would want to achieve when you got there? Janelle.
I'm super excited about technology. So science is really where I feel at home. Also economic development, bringing more dollars home to build on the work that we did with the CHIPS Act. And then just privately, I feel I'm really invested in the growth and the strength of historically black colleges and universities. I went to Florida A&M University, and it was a very special place for me. It's a very special place for African American students and all students. They're all open to grow their abilities to participate in the economy. They produce the highest number of doctors and lawyers for our communities, and I think that's really important for us to be able to participate in the economy on our terms and grow our families' wealth. So I would say science and technology, as well as education, supporting historically black colleges and universities.
Jamie.
Yeah, I mentioned before the Farm Bill because of the SNAP program and because a good portion of not just the district but our state is ag, and having some of that background, that's a real critical, often not the highest demand, but it's a really important one. Also on education as well, I believe passionately investing in education, and so that's from pre-K, K through 12, and then post-secondary. I mentioned the civilian GI Bill. So making sure that we are strengthening our economy by preparing our people. And also, Oregon has been weak. We have not had some of the benchmarks and measures in education because we haven't had the investments, and teachers are struggling. So I actually had an op-ed piece on both of these issues in the Bend Bulletin talking about the importance of the teacher strike and what the federal government can be doing to invest more in education, and then some of those more broad areas as well of cost of living in general for working families. And the Farm Bill as well, and actually call Lori out on failing to deliver for Oregonians. You can just Google it, it's the Bend Bulletin and with my name. But, being able to bridge these divides, work with folks across the urban-rural divide is critically important to both, not just to win elections, but ultimately to serve communities well. And this district, we're seeing a very different cycle. This year, we have well positioned throughout the districts. We've built those relationships. As was mentioned before, only a third of the voters in the district are Democrats. The majority of the district is outside the metro area. So whereas Democrats have all the legislators in the metro area are Democrats, there's a huge advantage. We need folks who win those purple areas and actually beat Lori in those purple areas last cycle. And that's how I'm going to beat her in November.
Well, I hope you folks agree with me that we've got two terrific candidates for this district. And please join me in thanking them for this evening.
Can we get a shout out for the organizers and our phenomenal moderator as well?
I think we've got budgeted in some time now to actually get a chance to speak to our candidates. So good luck.
Yes, awesome. So lastly, just a couple of thank yous before we break out once more. Once again, thank you to our amazing candidates. Truly awesome forum. We really appreciate y'all's time and y'all's willingness. And just thank you for giving us something to believe in. We appreciate y'all. Thank you to the partners who helped contribute and facilitate this event. The partners were Indivisible, as well as the Democratic parties of Deschutes, Lynn, Multnomah, Marion, and Clackamas County. And last but certainly not least, thank you to all of y'all. Tonight was truly democracy in action. Thank you for continuing to hope, continuing to believe, and continuing to try to manifest a future better than what has been. So thank you all. Have a good night. We'll be mingling for the rest of the program.